Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. As countries pile up massive debt, and the planet heats up, and old-style wars break out, and politics becomes more toxic at home and abroad, do we have any real chance of coming out okay? Let's get to the bottom line. Even before the coronavirus pandemic, it was obvious that something wasn't quite right with the economy, either here in America or around the world. There used to be confidence that the next generation would be better off than the last one. But nowadays, folks aren't so sure. Are we in the middle of a perfect storm that doesn't end well, with so much debt, and with the gap between rich and poor getting worse, and a warming planet, and job-killing technology on the way, and a globe-dividing rivalry between China and the U.S.? With people scared about their jobs and their future, and governments that don't want migration and don't want free trade anymore, are we already in the era of deglobalisation? Or at least slowbalization, as my guest today calls it. With so many interconnected, future of the world questions we need to think through, we're talking today with someone who can help us understand where we're going. He is Economist Nouriel Roubini, professor at New York University and author of Megathreats, 10 Dangerous Trends That Imperil Our Future and How to Survive Them. Well, you know, one of the things you write very compellingly about, Nouriel, in this great book, and I'll tell everybody, read this book. It's just an eye-opener on so many massive significant threats, not just financial, we're talking about right now, but climate change, AI, other dimensions. But you knew the late Paul Volcker well. I happen to know Paul Volcker well, and in some senses, he was the hero of a moment of coming out of an era of stagflation. And you write that we may be entering in another area. We may already be in an era of stagflation. What's wrong with, or why shouldn't we hope for another Paul Volcker to come raise interest rates to a crippling level to kill the fatness and the lethargy in the economy and the bad stuff? Why do you not think that there aren't heroes that come do the right things to get us out of this, threat-driven future we have?
I think it's unlikely for the following reason. In the 1970s, we had negative supply shocks. The oil shock of 1973 with the Yom Kippur War between Israel and Arab states, the second oil shock in 1979 following the Islamic Revolution in Iran. It led to inflation and recession. But at that time, in US and advanced economies, private and public debt as a share of GDP was only 100%. So we got inflation, we got recession, we got stagflation. But when Volcker hiked interest rates to 20%, we did not have a debt crisis in the US and Europe. We had one in Latin America, because they had borrowed like crazy in the 70s. And of course, when Volcker jacked up interest rates to 20%, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil defaulted. After the global financial crisis, we had much higher levels of debt, household debt, housing debt, bank debt, but we had a negative demand shock, a credit crunch. So we ended up with a deflation, and therefore we could do massive monetary, fiscal, and credit easing to save the economy and the market. Today, unfortunately, we have the worst of the 70s with a wide range of both short-term and medium-term negative aggregate supply shocks that will reduce production and growth and increase cost of production, stagflationary. But now we have debt ratios that are much higher than even after the GFC. And because inflation is rising, we cannot, into this economic downturn, cut interest rates. We have to do the opposite. The Fed and the other central banks are increasing them to fight inflation. So we have the worst of the 70s in terms of stagflationary shocks and the worst of the post-global financial crisis in terms of unsustainable debts. But now we're raising interest rates. So central banks are damned if you do and damned if they don't. If they do increase interest rates enough to fight inflation, and the Fed will have to go not to 5, but well above 6 because of how persistent inflation is, we can cause both a hard landing of the real economy and a financial market crash, because with interest at 6%, households, mortgages, credit card, student loans, auto loans, business loans for businesses, corporate bonds, and of course even public debts are going to become unsustainable. So we'll have an economic crash and a financial crash feeding on each other. And if instead the Fed were to blink, wimp out and say, we don't want to cause this economic and financial crash, and they do not increase interest rates enough to fight inflation, then like the 70s, we are behind the curve given the shocks. We have a de-anchoring of inflation expectation. We create a wage price spiral, and we ended up with much higher inflation, and eventually with supply shocks, we do not avoid the recession. We end up again into stagflation. So either way, we are in trouble given the shocks and given the much higher amounts of debts compared to the 70s, but even compared to the post-GFC period.
You know, you are creatively referred to sometimes as Dr. Doom, and you've said you don't like that term. You prefer Dr. Realist. And in this, and I'll tell our audience now, if you think that Nouriel Roubini was pessimistic with what we've just talked about, wait till you hear about climate change, AI, demography shifts, all these other component pieces that we're dealing with in our geoeconomic and geopolitical ecosystem and the interconnectedness of them. And I'd love you to share with our audience, it's a lot to talk about, it's a very compelling, dense book, but what are these other factors that actually make it very hard for political systems to respond that you say are other megathreats, that even if we get the finance side right, we're dealing with other dimensions that could really capsize us?
Well, as you pointed out in the book, in addition to economic, monetary, and financial risk, I talk about others that are connected to these economic and financial risks, but they're not directly so. One of them, of course, is the risk of Cold Wars getting colder and hot wars among great powers that are all armed with nuclear weapons. And we have a bunch of revisionist powers, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that are on a collision course with the US, Europe, and the West. We could have non-conventional conflict among great powers. Hot war in Ukraine is already getting worse. Israel might strike Iran this year, given Iran is becoming a threshold nuclear state. And the Cold War between US and China is getting colder by the day, and it's only a matter of time there will be a confrontation on the issue of Taiwan. That's one set of risks. Second one, of course, global climate change is becoming a disaster with acceleration in the rising temperature and the economic and financial damage from climate change across the world. Dozens of examples of what's happening today. It's a disaster. We've realized now that severe global pandemics may occur. COVID-19, for many reasons, is not going to be the last nor the most virulent. And while AI can increase the economic pie eventually, it leads to permanent technological unemployment among routine jobs that are blue-collar initially, but then white-collar jobs that are cognitive, that can be sliced in a series of automated tasks, and even some of the creative jobs, given the new generative AI techniques, will be eventually automated. It will also increase income and wealth inequality because these technologies are capital-intensive, skill bias, and labor-saving. So if you own the capital, you do well. If you are in the top 10% distribution of skill, AI makes you more productive, but everybody else gradually is going to have a challenge with their income and jobs. And finally, the economic manifestation of this rising inequality, economic malaise, young generation feeling they'll be worse off than their parents, is a backlash against liberal democracy. And radical, authoritarian, violent parties, populist parties of the extreme right or the extreme left are coming to power, both in advanced economies and in emerging markets. Now, I say that things are worse than the 70s and worse than the post-GFC period. In some dimensions, things are even worse than the 1930s. In those 30 years between 1914 and 1945, in spite of the first era of globalization, in spite of the first industrial revolution, we did not prevent World War I. Then we had the Spanish flu. Then we had the stock market crash of 29. Then the beginning of the Great Depression. Then inflation, deflation, hyperinflation, trade wars, currency wars, financial crisis, massive defaults, unemployment 25%. And then we had the rise to power of Nazis in Germany, fascists in Italy, Franco in Spain, militarist in Japan. Then we had World War II and we had the Holocaust. But as bad as those 30 years were, there are today 4 major new mega threats that did not even exist at that time. At that time, we didn't have to worry about climate change in the 30s. We didn't have to worry about AI destroying jobs. The computer had not even been invented. You know, at that time, we didn't have unfunded liability coming from aging. You know, we had just created Social Security, and the average worker would die at the age of 60 before he or she could get the first paycheck at 62. And as ugly as World War I and World War II were, they were mostly conventional wars. It was only at the end of World War II when, luckily, it was the US rather than Nazis or the Japanese who built the bomb. And unfortunately, we had to use it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end World War II. But if today there will be a conflict among major powers that are all armed with nuclear weapons, that conventional war would easily and very fast escalate into unconventional. And you could have a nuclear winter that could wipe out a good chunk of humanity. So by some standards, the current geopolitical depression is more dangerous in at least 4 key dimensions than even the ugliest time we had between 1914 and 1945.
So what you're talking about is a trap that we're in, that even proactive, positive steps can open the way for other problems. And I'd love you to share with us, am I reading that right? And how hard is it to escape and that trap, to deal with that, so that this bleak future, and we have any chance of escaping this bleak future that you write about?
You're right. But I point out in each chapter that there may be solutions to each one of these threats, but as economists know, there is no free lunch. Most of these solutions imply costs and sacrifices in the short run for the common good, domestic and global, over the medium long term. And unfortunately, the political economy of both democracy and autocracy is kicking the can down the road, because politicians who do the sacrifices in the short run are not going to be in power or be kicked out of power over time. And therefore, we tend to not doing what's necessary. That's one of the big dilemma we're facing. So there are problems, there are solutions. The question is whether they're likely to be implemented or not. And I give several examples. Say on climate change, why don't we do the right thing? There's at least 5 constraints. One is that in places like US, half of the country doesn't believe in human-driven climate change. So when they're in power, they reverse what we need to do. Second, there is an intergenerational conflict. I'm 65. I'll be lucky if I live another 30 years. A young person born today, he or she, will live at least 100 years. The young don't vote, the old vote. And even the young, are they willing to do the sacrifices to reduce their carbon footprint today? We should all become vegan. We should all install solar panel, insulate our homes, don't use plastic. Even the young are not willing to do it. Internationally, you have a free rider problem. If a country were to do all the effort and cost to cut emissions to 0 and nobody else does it, they don't get any benefits. The emissions are global and they pay the cost. And coordinating, agreeing 200 countries to do the right thing is mission impossible. Then there's a conflict between the rich and poor countries. We're telling China and India, cut your emission to 0 in the next 20 years, the way we want to do in Europe and US. They say, you created this problem for the last 200 years. 90% of the cumulative historic stock of emission comes from our industrial revolutions, and we created this problem. Now we're telling poor countries, remain poor, don't grow, to cut your emission to 0 in the next 20 years. They say, no way, we're not going to do it. We're going to raise them until we become middle class or rich, and then we're going to deal with this problem. Unless you bribe us, meaning you give us $1 trillion of transfer subsidies a year. US Congress has just passed $4 billion, spare change. No one in a poor country is going to do that for $4 billion. You need $1 trillion. And finally, in a world of global rivalries, US and China don't agree on how to deal with pandemics and was at fault for it. They don't agree on how to deal with economic and financial stability. They don't agree on free trade. They don't agree, of course, on global security. Very hard to agree on climate change. That's why there is so much greenwashing, green wishing, green fig leaves. Most of the ESG investment are just a fig leaf. They're not truly ESG. So I'm all in favor with dealing with the environmental disaster, because if we don't, we're going to destroy the planet. But there are at least 5, and I can give another 5 or 10, obstacles and constraint on doing what's desirable. So the reality is that what is likely to happen, unfortunately, is going to be very different from what's going to necessary to happen. That's why COP at Glasgow, COP at Sharm el-Sheikh were total COP out. We're on the way not to 1.5, not to 2. We're on the way to 2.5, possibly 3 degrees above pre-industrial level. Even 2 is a disaster. 2.5 is catastrophic. 3 is the end of our planet. That's what we're facing right now.
You know, one of the challenges you write about is the U.S. dollar losing its role as the reserve currency of the world. And you said that really is, correlated with nations that are powerful. You look at China rising. Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, once said, "Don't worry about this. Europe's a museum, Japan's a nursing home, and China's a jail," as a way to say we're going to be fine. Where is Larry Summers wrong?
It's wrong because the world is going to be divided in 2 major spheres of influence. One around US, Europe, the West, and our friends and allies, and one around China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, and many countries that are doing much more business and trade with China than they do with the West. And they're going to accept the Chinese model of state capitalism and of surveillance. So we'll have a decoupling of the global economy, 2 separate economic, trading, financial, investment, technological, and also socio-political systems, one around the West, one around China. And therefore, the Chinese are going to increasingly want to replace the US dollar when they do trade with their friends and allies and use the RMB. And they're already gradually doing it. Because, as the saying goes, if I owe you $1 billion is my problem. If I owe you $1 trillion is your problem. And Chinese are holding $1 trillion of foreign reserves in US dollar treasuries. But like it happened for Russia, where we seized those foreign assets of Russia, whether in dollar in Europe and so on, the Chinese are worried that as we are on a collision course with them on Taiwan, eventually we're going to do the same. So they're going and telling their friends and allies, let's invoice oil in the Middle East in RMB. Let me pay you in RMB. Why don't you hold some of your reserves into RMB, and so on and so on. And they're making inroads steadily and slowly and gradually. So the dollar is not going to disappear. It's going to remain a reserve currency. But from a unipolar world, where it's dollar dominance, 2/3 of all transaction and of reserve currency is dollar, we're going to go to a bipolar world, one centered around the US dollar, one centered around the RMB. That decoupling, fragmentation, and balkanization of the global economy becomes also a decoupling and fragmentation of the global reserves and currency system.
I want to quickly show our audience a photograph of a house you write about that was built through AI and 3D printing, and 2 people, 2 human beings built this home in remarkable time with machines. And I just want to give you an opportunity, Nouriel, to talk about the benefits that are going to come with technology and advancement and what we should be scared as heck about.
Certainly, AI, machine learning, robotic automation, quantum, and related technology eventually is going to increase the economic pie. Potential growth is going to become much higher. We're not yet seeing it in the aggregate macro productivity numbers. It's only a matter of time. That's the positive side of it. So there'll be more goods and services much cheaper. The dark side is multiple. 3 dimensions of it. One, increasingly massive, permanent technological unemployment. Initially, blue-collar routine jobs, then white-collar cognitive jobs, eventually, given generative AI, even creative jobs. Secondly, these technologies are capital intensive, skill biased, and labor saving. If you own the machine or the capitalists own the machine, you'll do well. If you are in the top maybe 15% of distribution of skills, education, human capital, probably the AI makes you, for the time being, more productive. But if you are a low value added or medium value added, blue collar, white collar, increasingly your job and income is going to be threatened by technology. That's why eventually we need UBI, universal basic income. But then what's a system where people don't have a dignity of work, that essentially, effectively, like parasites, will receive a welfare check for life? Is it sustainable, or what are the consequences socially and politically of that? It's a dystopian future, one in which essentially 95% of people live on UBI. It's not a utopian future, in my view. Final thing, most technological innovation derive usually by some governments who want to create bigger weapons to fight bigger wars. That's what led to World War I. That's what led to World War II. That's what led to the nuclear weapons era, and so on and so on. And we know the race on who's going to dominate AI, China or US, is not only who's going to dominate the industries of the future, but who's going to be the dominant geopolitical and military power of our times. That's why last year, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, wrote a book together with Henry Kissinger, our foremost geostrategist of our time in the US, about if China wins the war on AI, they're also going to be the dominant military and security power. And we don't want an authoritarian, state capitalist and aggressive China to dominate militarily the world. Absolutely not. So unfortunately, many innovation lead to weapons and then fight a bigger and nastier war. It happened World War I, it happened World War II, it happened with nuclear weapons coming before nuclear power. And even a startup nation like Israel, where there's lots of tech innovation, it starts in the military and then it goes to civilian application. The internet was created by DARPA. The Boeing 747 was a military project before it was commercial. So unfortunately, the development of this cyber weapon, autonomous drones and vehicles and robot soldiers, and the war in Ukraine is just the beginning of how AI technology can be used to fight a war, implies the risk of even more violent and more virulent and nastier military conflicts among great powers.
Well, in my conversations, I tend to be skeptical of optimism. And so this has been a great conversation. Economist Nouriel Roubini, founder of Roubini Macro Associates and professor at the Stern School of Business at New York University. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Great pleasure being with you and with your audience, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? It's not about being pessimistic or optimistic. Of course, humanity has survived all sorts of calamities since the beginning of time, and we all hope that we'll flourish in the future. But my guest today is right to point out that so many threats to the world as we know it are happening at the same time. Crazy amounts of debt, artificial intelligence, a new Cold War, a changing planet, and me-first policies everywhere. To me, this last one is the scariest. As individuals and as nations, folks just don't want to compromise or cooperate with each other for the collective good. And it's getting worse as resources diminish and people fight over crumbs. So when global challenges arise, think natural disaster or a global pandemic, good luck getting countries to sit down and do what's right for all of us. And that's the bottom line.